Hello everyone, Ramirez here, Tidewater Renaissance Fighting Arts. Um, I'm coming in here with a bit, not of a rant, but what I believe and what I'm naming this video as, in defense of DeKoven. And basically I want to reiterate some kind of rules that are listed in the DeKoven Accords for those of us practicing Harnishfechten. And I got to be honest with you, the reason that I'm doing this video is that I was at a armored tournament where one of the rules within DeKoven was kind of like, well, we don't really need this. We can be safe without it. And I kind of disagree. That is the tipping, the putting a rubber blunt or other item over the tip of either a sword being used in Harnishfechten or a dagger being used in Harnishfechten. I'm going to use daggers to make my point, but pardon the pun there, making the point, but I think this is just as relevant with swords being used for Harnishfechten, and that even if they are blunt, they still require, by the Accords, and for safety's sake, that they should be required to have rubber blunts or some other type of tip on them. Normally, we would have tips, and I'll bring a few examples here to the game. This is the rondel I use from Darkwood Armory. It's relatively thin. It has a bit of flex. You'll notice it has I believe it has a rolled tip, but I have also put a rubber blunt tip on it. This widens the point and gives that pressure, and this is the important part. The wider the area of contact, the more dispersal of pressure it has. I will move on once again to the new Purple Heart Harnishfechten dagger. And once again, this is it is a very stiff blade with virtually no flex. I have put on it one of the cane style tips. This is what Purple Heart recommends to put on these to make them safe. This is a very, very wide blunt, and once again, more surface area is dispersing the force. So that is the reason for that. And last, but certainly not least, in our club, we occasionally do still use the Purple Heart wooden rondels. And you can see this has a wide bulbous point. Obviously, being wood, it has no flex, but it is able to be very, very wide. And once again, that pressure will disperse. And there's a lot limited force this gives versus something like, let's say, the Purple Heart Steel Harnishfechten dagger. But all these can also be represented in their sword forms. You have the wooden wasters, which generally don't get blunts on them, but they are much less likely to have that point, can kind of disperse energy. And you have several different styles of Harnishfechten swords being used. And once again, they can have rounded edges. Some of them have points with rounded edges. And they really kind of they need a tip for a couple of reasons. To simulate, and I want to be very clear about this, this is a spear point. We don't use these anymore, this brand, in the club because we did have one break and I just did not feel comfortable with it. This has a blunted round edge. It is 1/2 an inch in the overall diameter, so it would fit within the DeKoven Accords, but it still technically requires a tip. And even though my main fighting helmet is a bassinet, I will kind of bring this up to show you this does not have a pierced plate, but with it being that wide, even if I try to, I cannot get it into the eye slot. If it had a tip and it grasped here, they would just count that as having gone through the eye slot, and I would be effectively defeated. So what's the big deal? Why would something like this need a tip? And it really came in the descriptions. My student, when they fought in there, they have a closed helm with a bever. By the DeKoven Accord, the bever should work as throat protection. And the person said, and once again, this being a 1/2 inch, This is that an eighth. It is not wide enough, and there is no flare at the end. I'm sorry, flare from this spear, but there is no flared point in the Harnishfechten dagger by Purple Heart. It is the same width all the way through. It has a rounded edge like a quarter-size semicircle, but there is no widening or spatulation of this tip. And people were making the argument, well, what happens if it goes up and under? And if it had had a tip, it probably wouldn't have even gotten that far. But without it, they were able to slide one in and show that even though we had a male standard, it wasn't a big deal. We added a HEMA throat plate underneath his standard, and he was allowed to compete. The thing that bothered me the most was seeing people with an untipped dagger like this trying to jam it up and get that space. And you might say, well, historically that's done. And I'm like, part of the rules is, and it's in the DeKoven Accord, is not to be a jerk. If someone gets past your throat protection, which is actually a lot easier than you think, or than you might think, what will it hit and where and how? Let's say, for example, we go to the most extreme. Let's say someone has a steel gorget. This would be very, very, very protective normally. With one small problem. If I push against this and I manage to get past this point, where is that going? And so let's say I'm grappling with someone, I'm trying to stab underneath their helmet. Even if I'm lucky enough and it catches the trauma protector, which is supposed to really protect right here, if it goes up, now you're talking about the soft palate of the neck, of the head. You're talking just underneath the jaw. And if you're really trying to jam with pressure there, that should be a no-brainer. This should stop beforehand. And I saw numerous attempts to kind of just jam this up. Even with a trauma plate, and there can be lots of variations. I'm going to kind of go through one. Let's say, and trauma plate shouldn't be that much different from having one of these. Well, what happens if I stab under here? Well, that's not going to affect anything. It's actually going to be quite bad. And obviously I can go over, once again, into the soft palate under the jaw. So that attack, really, we should be very, very conscious about whether or not that should be legal. It's not expressly forbidden by the DeKoven Accords, but I don't think is really what's intended. Now, this strategy historically is like, okay, how do you kill a knight? And usually it's like, if someone's thrown to the ground, you get a bunch of peasants to pin them down and you do whatever. Or like, let's say you're in like the last duel and you're straddling over a guy and you're really trying to kill them. That is a perfectly valid way of going about it. Should that really be what we're doing in honorable tournament conduct? I really don't think so. And if we are, if it had had that tip and someone just went underneath a bever, I think that's all you should need to do. You shouldn't need to actually jam it in anywhere to say, hey, you got the point, I concede. Normally, a lot of times what we tend to do, and I'm going to take a different dagger with a little flex, is that we try to stab like areas, like if someone has a helmet without, let's say, an aventail, they might try to go in and just press. And that, fine. Usually most helmets, like from here, you're not going to get that. You would try to like stab like a little lower. And that's where that trauma plate or your male standard would help you with that. And you go, okay, you got through it. But even with something, this is actually what I use with my kid. I have the full gorget. If they go any higher than that, they are still hitting. And certainly they could go up into this underneath my my bassinet. And I think that that's something we kind of need to address. The lack of that point, that dispersal. Also, rubber tips do give us an advantage. If it's in the chainmail, it can catch. This is an advantage over, let's say, the wooden thing where sometimes you can get slide from the chainmail. You may not get perfect purchase. But tips do help disperse that. And, without that on something like this, you can effectively use this as kind of a crowbar to lift and to move stuff, which I don't think we really intended when we started doing Passage of Arms events. And as I see, I've seen people kind of like go, well, this is an easy way to end the conflict, is to be like, okay, well, if I'm in grapple range and I have my dagger and I just put it up and in here underneath the helmet, and I see that as a little less than honorable, but it's fine if this is tipped. Yeah, I accept that as a risk that we take if this is tipped. I know that some people, once again, trying to be a little more historical, say, I don't like these rubber tips. I don't like how they look. We're involved in a dangerous sport activity. And I don't know that the benefits outweigh the risks. As I said, I'm all for, okay, someone has chainmail here or chainmail right by the neck, just an Aventail, and you stab this through. Sure, that's a point. If there's somewhere around the neck and they get into the standard and they hit here, put a little pressure in, I yield, you've got the point. But the idea of going, let's say, underneath a bever or something and really trying to jam up in here, especially with an untipped, heavy, non-flexing blade, that can't be cool. And I think the same thing certainly is true with the sword, where we have both hands and we're really kind of working that in, trying to work up and under a bever or a gorget, a solid plate gorget to get underneath there. It kind of exceeds the mandate of a civil duel of equals in arms. I'll let you kind of put your comments below if you think that, well, it's something you signed up for, it's something you agreed to. And in all fairness, when I signed up for a tournament that allowed it, I took that responsibility onto myself. Doesn't mean I have to agree with it, which is why I'm putting this post here as a response to whether or not we should be following the DeKoven Accord, where it's required that we put some sort of tip on these weapons to make them wider, to make them safer for use, especially if you're following the rules that say, if your visor, if your oculars have a certain required maximum width that you don't have to have perf plate, or even if you have perf plate, because the eyes are only one vulnerable area of the head, and we should be very mindful about what other things we can do, and that sometimes we need to make the weapon safer and not necessarily always the armor safer. There's nothing wrong with saying, hey, this particular tournament, they said, hey, perf plate is absolutely required. I get that, and I think that was fine, but perf plate over the oculars does very little to prevent if someone's trying to work around your gorget to get a point. And this is just way too vulnerable an area to really be working that, or if it is, then you should have to, have that tip on there. That would stop a lot of those shots could be called, like, once again, if you're able to get underneath a helmet, an Aventail, and just make that touch, it'd be a lot easier to go yield as they're kind of worming their way in there. If they make contact, say stop, then someone without this tip trying to jam this up into you underneath your helmet, where if they do manage to, there's no real way to protect under here if you have something with a male standard. Or even if you have something with a bever that's like kind of the chin, if they're getting that underneath there, it's going to kind of aim to the vulnerable spots. So in defense of DeKoven, we should probably consider whether or not, in an attempt for more historical combat or in an attempt to make things more challenging, because obviously Once you put this tip on there, if you're trying to, let's say, get through, if you have lames, trying to get between the lames is going to be virtually impossible unless someone has very, very loose lames. But if this wasn't there, you could absolutely slide this in and stab to the chainmail, or if they're not wearing chainmail, just get the point in. From a historical standpoint, I get that. But there are also historical techniques we do not use that are considered like anything with the poleaxe and wrenching the neck. We know the dangers of that, and we don't allow it. I think there's one more place where, yes, historically it might be done, but maybe we shouldn't be allowing it. So once again, this is Ramirez. These are just my thoughts. As I said, if you disagree with me, you want to put some thoughts down, I'd love to hear comments in the comment section below. And thank you for kind of listening to me talk, and hopefully we can all have a good time together. I want to bring a challenge out. I'm challenging someone at the end of this video. To my good friend, the Oklahoma Hedge Knight. I want to start talking about the DeKoven Accords for people doing Harnishfechten. I would love to see you talk about the Lynx Accords, because I don't really fight by those, but I know you do, and I would love to see some feedback from you talking about the Lynx Accords for those of us doing Harnishfechten. So once again, this is Ramirez with Tidewater Renaissance Fighting Arts. We're based out of Norfolk, Virginia, and I will see you in the next video.